The rain battered against the window of the small suburban house, streaking the glass with torrents of water as a lone figure sat hunched over a cluttered desk. The smell of stale coffee and worn leather filled the air. Detective Caleb Hart had been retired for 10 years. His days of chasing criminals replaced with fishing trips and quiet evenings. But peace was elusive. His nights were haunted by ghosts of unresolved cases. Chief among them the unsolved murders of 3 young women. A string of killings known as the White Rose murders, named for the delicate flower left at each crime scene. The case had turned cold decades ago. Caleb's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp chime of his doorbell. He frowned, glancing at the clock. Nearly midnight. Visitors were rare at this hour. Pulling on a robe, he made his way to the door and opened it to reveal a familiar face. Detective Erin Chase, his former protégé. Erin. Caleb's voice was laced with surprise. What brings you here this late? Her face was pale, her expression tense. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important, she said, stepping into the foyer. She handed him a thin file folder. We need your help. Caleb opened the file, his brows knitting together as he scanned the contents. Photographs of 2 crime scenes stared back at him. Both victims were young women. Their lifeless bodies posed with an eerie sense of care. And there it was, the unmistakable symbol of the killer, a pristine white rose placed on each body. You're telling me this is connected to the White Rose murders? Caleb's voice was quiet but firm. Not just connected, Erin replied. The MO is identical. The killer might be back, or maybe it's a copycat. Either way, we're out of leads, and the department thinks you're the only one who can crack this. Caleb exhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on the photographs. Memories flooded back. The frustration of dead ends, the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions. He'd buried the case with his career, but it had never truly left him. I'm retired, Erin, he said, though his resolve was already wavering. You're still the best we've got, she countered. If you won't do it for the victims, do it for yourself. You deserve closure. The words struck a chord. Caleb knew she was right. With a reluctant nod, he closed the folder. All right, let's get to work. The next morning found Caleb back in the precinct, a place he hadn't stepped foot in for a decade. The familiar hum of ringing phones and shuffling papers greeted him. Erin led him to a conference room, where a team of detectives waited. They briefed him on the 2 new murders and the startling similarities to the cold case. The victims' profiles matched those from years ago, young women in their 20s. All with ties to a now defunct charity organization called Haven's Grace. Caleb's first step was to revisit the original case files. Hours turned into days as he pored over old evidence, cross-referencing it with the new murders. Patterns began to emerge, but they were elusive, like a shadow slipping through his fingers. The victims had been targeted with precision, their deaths meticulously planned. But why? As Caleb dug deeper, he discovered that Haven's Grace had been embroiled in scandal before it shut down. Embezzlement, blackmail, and whispers of a human trafficking ring. The deeper he went, the murkier the waters became. And then he found it. A name that linked all the victims. Richard Langston. A prominent businessman who had been a major donor to the charity. Langston had died in a car accident shortly after the original murders. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. It was Erin who brought the breakthrough. Langston had a son, she said, placing a newspaper clipping on the desk. The article featured a young man in his 20s, Michael Langston. He was only a teenager during the original murders, but he's resurfaced recently. He's been seen in the same areas where the new victims were last spotted. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. Could the son be carrying on his father's dark legacy? Or was he seeking vengeance for sins long buried? The investigation took a dangerous turn as Caleb and Erin followed Michael Langston's trail. It led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air inside was thick with decay, and the walls were covered in faded graffiti. In the center of the room, they found a chilling display, a shrine of photographs and newspaper clippings, all centered around the victims of the White Rose murders. But before they could piece it all together, the sound of footsteps echoed through the space. Michael Langston emerged from the shadows, a gun in his hand and a twisted smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice calm yet menacing. "You've ruined everything." Caleb stepped forward, his hands raised. "Michael, we just want to understand. Help us make sense of this." Michael's eyes flickered with emotion, anger, pain, and something else Caleb couldn't quite place. "They had to pay," he said, "for what they did to my father, to my family. Haven's Grace wasn't a charity. It was a front for monsters." The pieces clicked into place. Michael had uncovered the dark secrets of Haven's Grace and taken justice into his own hands. But his methods had only perpetuated the cycle of violence. Before Caleb could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Erin had called for backup. Michael turned toward the noise, his grip on the gun faltering. Caleb seized the moment, lunging forward and disarming him. They wrestled briefly before Michael crumpled to the ground, defeated. In the aftermath, Michael's confession led to a cascade of revelations about Haven's Grace and its corrupt leaders. The case was finally closed, but it left Caleb with a bitter taste. He'd solved the mystery. But at what cost? The scars of the past could never truly heal. As Caleb returned home, the rain began to fall once more. He sat by the window, staring out into the storm. The shadows of yesterday lingered, but for the first time in years, they felt a little less heavy. He had faced his demons and brought the truth to light. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost.